it gotten worse? Do you feel we're on the same track? What is your take on what is going on with the economy? Because we see the stock market continually moving up and up and up. So what is your take overall on what the economy is doing right now?
Well, I think not just in the U.S., but basically across almost the entire Western world, we're immersed in a greater depression. There's no economic growth of any kind. All we have are falsified statistics designed to pretend that these economies are growing. Because if you look closely at the numbers, there's no possible way that anybody who understands what the numbers mean can believe that these economies are actually growing.
I mean, do you think we're in a recession?
Depression.
So you're going as far as a depression.
And I mean, all you have to do is go to your local shopping mall. There's been a massive construction boom in residential housing. But there's no new shopping malls being built in Canada or in the U.S. In fact, I think it's been well over a decade since a single major new mall has been constructed in the U.S. So the question is, you've got all of these new houses being built, all of these new apartment buildings being built, and of course our population's growing. Well, where's the commercial space to support all of this residential development? It isn't there. And I mean, sure, the media will talk about, growing online sales, but if you look at the numbers there, once again, it doesn't add up, because even with all of the quote-unquote massive growth in online sales over the past decade, online sales still account for less than a quarter of all retailing. And I mean, so this is still a small minority of the retail sector, and it doesn't explain, why supposedly growing economies don't require any more commercial shopping space.
And it's very interesting when we're talking about retail and things like that. I saw on Yahoo News where they're saying the retail apocalypse has hit, and they're saying that starting in 2017, going the first half of 2017, there's about 3,500 stores they're going to be shutting down. And we know Sears, JCPenney, Payless is going to be closing down 1,000 stores. So we definitely see that things are deteriorating very, very quickly, because they're just talking about the first half of 2017 and having so many stores shut down, which means that there's going to be a lot of people unemployed, which means where do they find work? I mean, this whole thing seems to be like it's just completely breaking down very, very quickly now. Even though the stock market's going up, the real economy seems like it's breaking down and getting worse.
Beg to differ somewhat when you characterize this as a rapid change, because of course, large numbers of retail businesses don't go bankrupt overnight. That is a long-term phenomenon. So, but of course, what the media wants to do is to portray things like these as quote-unquote sudden events. So, of course, when the crash of '08 hit, that was supposed to be a surprise and a shock and a sudden collapse. Well, of course, anybody who was paying attention, noted that the U.S. economy had clearly peaked at the end of 2006, was already starting to turn lower in 2007, and by 2008 it was already in complete free fall. But yet, according to the mainstream media, everything just basically fell apart in the fall of 2008. Well, it's total fiction. And the same with this narrative about the retail sector. There's no sudden apocalypse occurring. What we've seen is a steady grind lower for the better part of 15 years. And, all you have to do is look closely at each U.S. holiday shopping season. And, every year it's the same ridiculous charade. You get to Black Friday and you get all of this ludicrous propaganda from the mainstream media about, oh yeah, it's going to be a great year. Projections are for, plus X number of percent. And I mean, every year, by the time the dust settles, it's the same thing. Retailers are reporting terrible sales, blah, blah, blah. The only U.S. retailer that didn't have a disastrous shopping season this year was Walmart. Well, it doesn't mean the retail sector is strong. It means that the U.S. consumer can't afford to shop anywhere else. They have to go to the bottom of the barrel because that's the only place they can still afford to shop. So, when that's the state of the economy, there's nothing sudden about that. The U.S. consumer didn't suddenly end up penniless. This is a long, steady grind of increasing unemployment, steadily lower real wages, and of course it manifests itself on the bottom line of the retail sector. And that's why the mainstream media has been making this great effort to pretend that the retail sector is not only been holding its own, but actually growing in recent years. And I mean, that's the most ludicrous part. You have this ridiculous narrative. Oh yeah, there's been this 8-year recovery and the retail sector's been strengthening for 8 years, and now we're going to have this apocalypse. Well, how does that make sense? Of course, it doesn't make sense.
No, it really doesn't. I wanted to get your take on what the Federal Reserve did, because when Trump was elected in November, in December, they decided to raise the interest rates by 25 basis points. Then they decided to raise the interest rates again, another 25 basis points. And they're expecting to raise it again, maybe a second time, or actually a third time, a fourth time. Is this the right time to start raising rates?
Well, it is if you want to create a good crash. But I mean, of course, there's two ways to reply to a question like that. The first, the more longer term way of looking at this is that our interest rates have been recklessly low for way, way too long, lower than any other time in our history, and left there. And I mean, that is total insanity. If it could ever be a good idea to do that, we would have done it before. The fact that our economies have never, our governments have never engaged in interest rate policy this reckless is because, any other responsible government would have looked at what these central banks are proposing and said, you're insane. Because, of course, the first thing you get with ultra low interest rates are asset bubbles all over the place. So, and this is the other part of the phony narrative. The mainstream media trying to pretend that U.S. equity markets aren't in bubbles, trying to pretend that real estate markets aren't in bubbles. It's ludicrous. First of all, if you have interest rates this low for this long, you must end up with bubbles. And the only reason the bubbles haven't been much, much bigger and already exploded is because these economies are so sick and anemic that even with interest rates pressed down to the floor, they can't generate any more activity than they have. I mean, if this had been 20 years ago and they would have taken interest rates down to even 1%, they would have had to jack them up again a year later, because our economies would have overheated such a ridiculous degree that it would have been obvious to everybody in the world that interest rates had to go higher and go higher rapidly. So what have we seen instead? 8 years of 0% interest rates, and then rates now creeping up higher at the slowest rate in history. It's so we need to have higher interest rates, because having interest rates this low is incredibly damaging. It destroys the savings of everyone with any savings. It kills people on fixed incomes, because of course they're not getting any interest on their savings, and of course people that are supposedly having cost of living adjustments in their fixed payments are getting no adjustments because these lying governments pretend there's no inflation. So, anybody and everybody on fixed incomes is getting totally annihilated economically by what's been taking place over the past 8 years. So for those people alone, interest rates need to go higher. But for the economy as a whole, obviously, you don't wait until asset bubbles have spiraled to reckless levels and then say, okay, well, now is a good time to start raising interest rates. Well, no, the good time to start raising interest rates was 5 years ago. So, that's of course the crux of the matter here, is they're starting to raise them much too late. And what happens when you start to raise interest rates much too late? Well, just look to what happened in 2008. Of course, the Federal Reserve started raising rates too late at the end of that cycle, and it ended up precipitating a horrendous crash. And now, of course, we've had rates frozen at much lower levels for much, much longer. The central banks are much, much later in beginning to raise the yield curve up. So they're going to create a much, much worse crash. It's just ABC.
How many interest rate increases do you think we're going to get before things start to really wrap? I mean, you're saying we're in a depression already. I mean, I say we're in a recession. You're saying we're in a depression. Are they going to be able to get to the next one or the one after that?
Well, I mean, there's different ways of approaching this. I'm pretty sure that we've discussed in some of my previous appearances the insanity and fraud in our monetary system, and specifically when a 0% interest rate is by definition, it's fraud. There's no such thing as a 0% interest rate. By definition, an interest rate is a positive number. It's the price you pay for the use of capital. The use of capital is a valuable thing. You can never have free capital. That's inherent fraud. If you were to try to do in your own personal financial affairs, do some 0% interest loans, and then you reported those transactions to the IRS. The IRS would say to you, no, Dave, what you're calling a 0% interest loan is a sham transaction. We're going to call it what it really is. We're going to call it a gift, and we're going to tax you on that basis. So when the Federal Reserve claims to have been loaning trillions of dollars to Wall Street banks at 0% interest, that's not what happened at all. It gave trillions of dollars to the Wall Street banks. And so that leads us to the second part of the fraud, fractional reserve banking. So the current level of this fraud is that Western banks are allowed to lend out $35 for every dollar they actually receive. Well, when you receive dollars at 0%, you can lend them out at 0% and not lose anything. So these fraudulent central banks and fraudulent big banks, first of all, create the fraudulent money at the central bank level. Then they give the money to the big banks, and then the big banks can loan, quote unquote, that money back and forth between each other at 0%, except at 35-to-1 multiples. So if you take even a chain of 3 banks doing this, they can legally counterfeit $1 quadrillion. So if you consider the big bank crime syndicate sitting with literally infinite amounts of legally counterfeited money, if they choose to leak some of this into our economies, they can prop up these train wrecks, for almost as long as they want. I mean, you can extend insanity infinitely long if you have infinite amounts of funny money to play with. So, but I mean, then it just becomes a matter of when does the disconnect become so great between what's actually taking place in the economy and what our governments are reporting on their balance sheets that everybody says, well, there's something very fishy going on here. But absent the banking crime syndicate propping up our governments with their funny money, there's very little capacity to withstand interest rate increases in any of these economies.
So we have interest rates moving up. We have the real economy, which is in a depression. And then we have the debt ceiling, which came up March 15th, but it looks like we did not hit the $20 trillion mark. Looks like Trump was able to cut some of the budget, and he was able to bring down the debt about $100 billion or so. So it looks like we're at 19.8 right now. Now, from what you're looking at, are they going to raise the debt ceiling once again and kick the can down the street and say, okay, we'll revisit this 8 months later?
Well, of course, I hate to be doing this to you again, but there's 2 ways I can answer that question. So just to start with, what the U.S. calls its national debt is a totally fictitious number that has no resemblance at all to the real world. I'm sure you've heard many times in the past about how the U.S. has this absolute mountain of quote-unquote unfunded liabilities, and that people such as Lawrence Kotlikoff are estimating that those unfunded liabilities total approximately $200 trillion. So, talking about a debt approaching $20 trillion when you're acknowledging that there's $200 trillion in obligations that you're not putting on your balance sheet, makes the $20 trillion a totally fictitious number. And part of the reason it's fictitious is direct government fraud. And I don't know if your audience is familiar with this, but one of the devices the U.S. government has used to cook the books, and this goes all the way back to the Clinton years, is borrowing from itself. And of course, the fraud there is that the U.S. government has various quote-unquote trust funds. And I'm sure all of your listeners know what a trust fund is. That's a pile of money with very strong safeguards in place to make sure it can't be encroached upon for the wrong reasons. And so the U.S. government has all of these trust funds, Social Security, Medicare, blah, blah, blah. And of course, it means that that money is only for one purpose. The Social Security Trust Fund is to pay Social Security premiums. The Medicare Trust Fund is to, pay for Medicare, et cetera. Well, what the U.S. government has been doing is borrowing out of these trust funds. I don't know if any left in them. So of course, this is total fraud, because if it didn't borrow these dollars, it would have to report them as debt. But by borrowing from itself, it calls this borrowing a liability. So the U.S. government has fraudulently converted trillions of dollars in liabilities over the past 20 years into quote-unquote unfunded liabilities through this fraud of borrowing from itself. So, the U.S., even in the most narrow definition of national debt, the U.S. is way over 20 trillion already. It just has been engaging in such fraudulent bookkeeping that if a corporation ever tried to do it, people would be going to jail right, left, and center instantly. I mean, no doubt about it. Even in the lax accounting rules of the United States, corporations could not get away with what the U.S. government is doing for 2 seconds. It's total fraud. So, but to get back to the original question, well, of course, they're going to have to continue to raise the debt ceiling. I mean, there's only 2 choices: raise the debt ceiling or debt jubilee. And debt jubilee means we wipe all our debts clean, and the banking crime syndicate no longer has this debt chokehold over all of our nations. So, that's going to be the last thing that ever happens. So as long as these nations can pretend that they're not completely bankrupt, they're going to keep raising their debts and raising their debts. And look what happened with Greece. In the quote, Greek crisis from last year, Greece begged to be allowed to declare bankruptcy. And the ECB and the EU said, no, we're not going to allow you to declare bankruptcy. We're going to force you to borrow more money. So what could be more insane than that? What could be more insane than forcing a bankrupt entity to borrow more money? So, if that's what's happening with Greece, then, obviously, what's going to be happening with the rest of these nations is just continue to pump the levels of debt higher and higher and higher until, there's no capacity for the system to hold together any longer. And this is also a big part of the reason for fraudulently manipulating interest rates this low, is if interest rates were at any quasi-rational level, these deadbeat debtor nations would have already been driven into bankruptcy. When Greece declared bankruptcy for the first time in 2010, it happened after the banking crime syndicate drove its interest rates up to 30%. So, it was ridiculously bankrupt. It defaulted in 75% of its debts in 2010, and 2 years later, it was already bankrupt again. So, with the U.S., if it was forced to pay a market rate of interest on these massive debts where there's no prospect of ever repaying them, the U.S. would be paying, 8, 10, 12% interest on its own debts, and it could handle that for about 6 months before the whole economy would blow up, at the most. And that's assuming that, of course, the banking crime syndicate doesn't, flood its funding money in there to prop it up.
So this brings me to your articles that you wrote when the tidal wave hits, and you wrote a 3-part series, and you're saying that a disaster is coming. We're in a depression right now, but the main disaster, it's heading our way. Can you just break down, I'm not saying go through each one of your articles, but break down, summarize what you think is going to happen?
Well, the first installment of the series was devoted to just pointing out how we have a number of massive economic problems that are all much worse than any other time in history, and simultaneously. So we've had, serious problems in the past, and we've had serious unemployment problems. We've had, debt and deficit woes at various times. We've had horrendous asset bubbles at various times, but we've never had all of these things all together and at the worst levels of history, and much worse than any other level of history. Like I was saying before, our governments aren't simply insolvent; they're bankrupt. If they were corporations, they would have already been forced to declare bankruptcy. So that's strike one against us. Strike two are these ridiculous asset bubbles, and of course we've dealt with that. Put interest rates at ridiculously low levels, you're going to create the biggest asset bubbles in history. They're here. And and there's no and of course, because these asset bubbles are derived from these recklessly low interest rates, there's absolutely no possible exit strategy. If these asset bubbles had somehow come into being with interest rates at 2 or 3%, well then maybe there's some leeway of pricking the bubble without some catastrophic event. But when you have interest rates pressed down to the floor, and basically that means like the accelerator pressed down to the floor in our economies, and you leave the accelerator at the floor for 8 years, there's no easy exit from that. Imagine being behind the wheel of a car and just having your foot pressed to the floor for 8 years. Well, long before you get to 8 years, you're going to crash into something. There's no way you could ever drive full speed for 8 years. So that's strike two is the asset bubbles. And then, the other side of things is we've got this horrendous combination of the worst structural employment in our history and the lowest wages for our workforce. The disconnect between rich and poor has never been this great. They talk about it being similar before the crash of 29, but it wasn't this bad. So, and of course, that's another cause for the crash of 29, the huge disconnect between rich and poor. 2,000 years ago, Greek philosopher Plutarch wrote that an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. So 2,000 years ago, it was already old news that the fastest way to destroy an economy was to let the rich people hog all the money. So, our ridiculously insane, extreme, ultra-extreme right-wing governments have been doing everything possible to funnel all of our economic wealth into the hands of the top 1% for the past 15 years. Well, where is that going to lead? Well, just ask Plutarch. He knew the answer to that 2,000 years ago. None of the clowns in the mainstream media know the answer to that today.
When this tidal wave hits, when everything starts to really fall apart, are we looking at a similar situation that we had back in 2008 or maybe back in 1929? Or are we looking at something completely different? And if you can, if you have the answer to this, what is the everyday person? What are they going to experience? I mean, people have their pensions, people have their savings, people are working in their jobs, people go to the grocery store, people are living their everyday lives. How much of it is going to change?
Ultimately, as I was saying before, we are going to be forced into a debt jubilee. The government debt levels, the corporate debt levels, the personal debt levels are way beyond the point of these debts ever possibly being retired and repaid. That can't happen. So when the debts spiral out of control, there's only one answer. And I mean, that's been the answer for more than 2,000 years. And, at one time, debt jubilee, in Christian, back in the ancient Christian times, debt jubilee was a phenomenon they had every 20 years or every 50 years. And it was scheduled because the idea was, well, that's how long it takes us to go insane and blow ourselves up with debt. So this is there's nothing controversial about saying we're heading to debt jubilee. It must happen, but before we get there, how bad can things get? So look at Greece. Greece has been when the government was still honest before the bankers got to their current government and corrupted them and got them to accept all this new debt and accept all the other economic crimes against humanity that are being posed on Greece. Greece, its economy is destroyed. It has an unemployment rate of I believe more than 20. The official unemployment rate is more than 25% for the broader population. But of course, that's the official unemployment rate. The real rate's much worse. Official youth unemployment is more than 50%. The real rate's much worse. The suicide rate in Greece is more than doubled. The economy is in complete ruins, and they're still not letting Greece, pull the plug. So this is what we're looking at for our own economies. We've got people with debt levels beyond anything that's sane. We've got governments beyond debt levels that are anything that's sane. So what are the governments going to do to forestall bankruptcy? Well, what have they been doing to date? They've been slashing social programs and jacking up taxes on ordinary people. So, what's that going to do as our economies already start to implode? Well, we've seen what that does in Europe. Their so-called austerity has not caused the slightest bit of improvement in any European economy. It's been the exact opposite. With all of these European economies, the more emphatic has been the austerity, the faster the economies have sunk. So the only economies in Europe that have managed to, not totally go into the tank are the ones that refuse to engage in austerity. Like the UK pretended to engage in a couple years of austerity. But while it was doing that, I mean, it had its pedal to the metal in terms of its monetary policy. So, it's like driving a car with one foot pressed down to the floor on the gas pedal and the other foot pressed down on the floor on the brake simultaneously. That's what the UK was doing. But for the other European, economies, the so-called BRIC or pigs nations, I mean, they've been basically in pure austerity mode, cut, tighten, and just dying. It's the equivalent of a somebody with severe anorexia going to see a doctor, and the doctor saying, "Oh, well, I think the best thing for you is to go on a diet." What's that going to do? It's going to kill the patient. So that's what's been happening in Europe. These economies that were already ridiculously sickly because there was not enough capital circulating in them, have been imploding because the government is sucking more capital out with austerity. And conversely, Iceland refused to touch its social programs after the crash of '08. While other Western governments were butchering their social programs, Iceland was butchering its big banks, and it left its social programs intact. So, of course, today, Iceland has the strongest economy in the West, and everybody else is going bankrupt. But so to sort of backtrack to where you're going originally, so, what we're heading for is going to be so much worse than the crash of '29, because in 1929, people were still solvent at the household level. Our governments were completely solvent. Corporations were, with occasional exceptions, solvent. So there was a capacity to withstand a downturn, because when solvent entities, are faced with a contraction, they can cannibalize resources and savings. Well, there's nothing to cannibalize. Our governments have been doing all of their cannibalizing during the so-called good times. They've cannibalized everything they could, and that's so. That's why we've gone past the era of quote unquote bailouts, and we're now in the era of quote unquote bail-ins, because when the big banks come screaming for their next handouts, i.e. their next round of blackmail, there's nothing at all that our governments can hand to them. They've got nothing left anywhere. So the only thing they can do to satisfy the appetite of these criminal big banks is start stealing out of private accounts of ordinary people. So that's what the bail-in's all about. There's nothing left for our governments to cannibalize, for anything, and certainly not for the crash in our economies that's coming. So, this is the problem. We're facing the worst crashes in history spread across every facet of our economies, with no resources to withstand even the slightest downturn.
Now, do you think savings, pensions, the dollar, do you think that that's going to disappear during this crisis? Because when we go back to 2008 and you heard them talk that, people wouldn't be able to get cash out of the ATM, insurance companies like AIG, the big banks, they would all go under. If you're saying this is going to be worse than 2008, then we're looking at a catastrophic failure of the system, where even the funds people have, that's not going to be accessible. They're not going to be able to get to it.
Well, okay, so the catastrophic failure in 2008 was our weak governments caving into blackmail. The only responsible strategy in 2008 was to put all the big banks to death immediately. And that's capitalism. In capitalism, a quote-unquote recession and quote-unquote deflation is a healing mechanism. Deflation is what occurs in capitalist economies to purge malinvestment and to purge bad debt. So this, of course, is why this banking crime syndicate is insanely phobic about deflation, and why they have their propaganda machine preaching to us over and over again that deflation is the worst thing that could ever happen in the universe, because it's the worst thing that could ever happen in the universe for the banking crime syndicate. And so this is the whole point, is that there's no capacity in the system to withstand what always happens in a downturn, which is deflationary pressure. So, in the Great Depression, for all the horrors of that episode, there was never any danger of our governments going bankrupt. There was a long period of retrenchment and a lot of bad debt and malinvestment to purge, but that was what healed the economies. The Great Depression wasn't the disease. The Great Depression was the cure. The disease was what happened before that. So, what's going to happen to our economies is what has to happen to heal these totally hollowed out economies where everything has been skewed. Like all of the wealth in our economies has been misallocated. So in any rational economy, the financial sector is not 25% of the economy. In a rational economy, the financial sector is 5% of the economy. So, so for instance, going back through decades and decades of our history, in terms of our economic policies, it was always the government's fiscal policies which are completely dominant. And monetary policy was just this tiny little influence which could, nudge the economy slightly in one direction, slightly in another. And the reason it was like that is because, fiscal policy is supposed to be what dominates. In the real economy, that's what fiscal policy is, the real economy. So we live in economies now where monetary policy totally drowns out fiscal policy. And this is why you see the markets move the way they do. Real markets don't move up and down like yo-yos like our markets do day after day, where everything goes up together, everything goes down together day after day. Real markets diverge because in a real economy, the fundamentals of companies are what drive markets, not what's the Federal Reserve saying today. This is the greatest, one of the greatest indications of how perverted our economies have become is the ridiculous overemphasis on what central bankers say. Go back 30 years, and you could never find a headline about what a central banker said. And, even when the central bankers did something, it would generally be page 3, page 4. So you look at it today, Bernanke or Janet Yellen opens their mouth, and it's, a huge font headline on the page 1. It's insane. So this is the problem. The economies have been destroyed in every respect, and they're already completely destroyed. And now we're about to have the worst crash in history. So it's not like in the past where, what we would be looking at today would be the aftermath of some horrible event. We're being told that these are good times. A recovery. The U.S. economy has been completely destroyed. It's been on a steady downhill incline for 20 years, and yet, we've all been led to believe it's been, has had an 8.5-year recovery.
I don't want to put you on the spot here, but we're talking about this and we know it's coming. We know that a lot of this, what we've been seeing, is completely manipulated. It was a gigantic illusion that they kept most of the people in the dark of what was really going on, pretending that we were in this recovery. Here we are today. When do you think that things will start to really come down where people notice? And I'm not saying like, oh, it's happening already, because yes, I understand that, you understand that, but there's many people out there that are just completely sleeping. They don't realize, because they're looking at the stock market and they're saying, well, look, it's 20,000 points. It's going up. The economy's good. When will they start to notice that things aren't doing well?
Well, I was totally convinced that the bankers were going to pull the plug last year. And I'm sure you remember me talking about that. Yes. And it was based on the previous bubble and crash patterns we've seen over the last 16 years. 8-year bubble cycle, schedule to crash, 8-year bubble cycle, schedule to crash. So we had our 8 years. I expected to see the crash again. Now, maybe that was just a little bit too much pattern repetition even for the bankers, despite being the arrogant bastards they are. But the other way of looking at this is that the bankers themselves may be scared about what's going to happen. They maybe were fully intending to pull the plug long before now, but they're getting cold feet. And the reason I say this is because one of the reasons that the bankers orchestrate these bubble and crash cycles, and there always has to be a bubble and a crash, is because after the bankers have pumped up their asset bubbles and equity markets, to a certain level, there's no more money for the crime syndicate to make. Pumping the Dow up to 40,000 isn't going to make much more money for them. Because to get it to 40,000, they're going to have 90% of the money to pump into the markets to get to there is going to be their own money. So you don't make money by playing with your own money. That's not how criminals operate, not how gamblers operate. You make money by scamming other people, letting them play with their money. So this is why it's necessary to schedule a crash, take the markets down, reset them at a low level, and then start another bubble and crash cycle again. And of course, the extra advantage for the banking crime syndicate is that since they are in total charge of this quote unquote business cycle, and they know when the crash is going to come because they are going to trigger it themselves, they can place their short bets well ahead of everybody else. So they make monstrous profits on the way down, just like they made monstrous profits on the way up because they knew what this was going to happen, and they placed all their long bets ahead of everybody else. So when you manipulate the markets in this complete manner, and you can always place your bets ahead of everybody going in either direction. It makes no sense at all to have the markets run in one direction for too long. So we're way overdue for a crash already. Is it going to happen, in 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 years? You would have to be a fly on the wall in, one of the bankers' meetings to know that.
Let me ask you this. How long do you think this period of time where we're in this, I guess we'll call it a Great Depression, a collapse scenario, how long do you think it will last?
Maybe the better way of approaching that is rhetorically. And my question would be, what is it ever going to lead these economies out of the crash that is coming? And I mean, because of course, this is going to start sounding insane to some of your listeners, but I mean, I've been contemplating scenarios that go literally to, a road warrior sort of level. Because I mean, this is the sort of level of destruction that we are seeing economically. If there was even a semblance of legitimacy in our governments, they would have pulled the plug on what's been going on several years ago. It's the fact that all of these governments are hopelessly corrupt and completely owned by the bankers that it's been allowed to go on this long. And once again, I'll refer back to Greece. Greece managed to actually get an honest government elected, stayed honest for several months, and Greece was begging to be allowed to declare bankruptcy. So, I mean, that's the real state of the world, is we're dealing with a lot of bankrupt governments. And, the plug should have been pulled long before now. And of course, as with any scenario, when you go into extremes, the more extreme that things get, the worse the consequences are. So, we're so much past where the plug should have been pulled. I mean, if we go back to when we supposedly emerged from the crash of '08, in my wildest dreams, I did not think we could get through 2010 before everything fell apart. But the old saying, in markets and even in economies is that trends always continue, much beyond when any sane person thinks they should come to an end.
So, I mean, going back to my original question, I mean, do you think this is going to be like a 3-month, 6-month, 8-month time period before things start looking better?
5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Really? That long?
So, and a good way of looking at this is the real estate markets. So, Western real estate markets are all in ridiculous bubbles. The U.S. market had a partial deflating of its bubble in the crash of 2008, but only a partial deflating. When U.S. house prices dropped on average by 30%, they needed to drop by 60% to take them back to rational levels. And we can illustrate this in simple arithmetic, because there's a very simple relationship when it comes to housing. And it's basically that housing prices and incomes must always be parallel over the long term. Well, if you look what's happened over the 20 years, housing prices have been on the steepest incline in the history of our societies, certainly in our lifetime. Wages have been flat. So, we've got this ridiculous disconnect that's way, way wider than any other time in the history of our economies. And we've got this disconnect during a time of massive unemployment and wage depression. So, it's not even like that, the worker's been holding his own over this 20 years. The average worker has been sinking. So it's not even like the housing is going up and the income curve is flat. It's housing is going up and the income curve is descending. So, imagine, that trend going on for 20 years and the disconnect. So, once again, U.S. house prices have been pumped up off of their lows. The U.S. housing market has to drop about 60% to get back to rational levels from where it is right now. But what they already discovered after the crash of '08 is they can't take the housing market all the way down to the bottom in one gulp. Even when they took the U.S. market down 30% after the crash, or in the crash of '08, what they discovered was they were driving homeowners into foreclosure and bankruptcy so quickly that they couldn't even foreclose as fast as they needed to. So when the banking crime syndicate decides to trigger the big crash, they will have to take our real estate markets down in several stages. It probably is going to be like a 15% crash really fast, and then it'll supposedly level off so that they can process all the people that have been wiped out and steal their homes. And then there'll be another 15% crash and a supposed, leveling off, and then, steal all the homes from those people. And then another 15% crash, blah, blah, blah. And of course, it's even worse in Canada. There's been no correction in Canada's housing prices. The city I live in Vancouver, it's one of the, most insane housing markets in the world, and it would be worse. But fortunately, our provincial government got cold feet, and they instituted a tax on foreign buyers, which is basically kneecapped our housing market. And Vancouver's already started to turn lower. But Toronto, it's still, maximum bubble mode. And so, these markets are overvalued by a minimum of 75%. But of course, when those markets crash, as I was saying before, markets always overshoot on the way down. So, the housing markets in Vancouver and Toronto, they have to fall by somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% before there's going to be a final bottom.
Wow.
So imagine what that's going to do. And, in the largest population centers in Canada, when that happens to people that have no savings and sky high levels of debt, and their wages have been flat for years and years and years, and they're probably going to lose their job as well. Many of them are going to lose their jobs as well when the next crash starts. So, and that's just, real estate. That's just one aspect of the collapse that's going to take many, many years just to unwind. So, we can't possibly bottom and go up again in 3 months, because we can't possibly reach the bottom in 3 months or even 3 years. We can't possibly get to the bottom in 3 years.
Yeah, you actually match what Cliff High, I don't know if you know who Cliff High is, but he says this is going to take about 5 years or so. And you're saying, 5, 10, it's around that same time frame. And, this is just going to be just a horrific time coming up. It really is. Jeff, I really appreciate you being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Thank you very much. Once again, how can people see your writing and see your work?
My own site is bullionbullscanada.com, and that's actually gone kind of dormant because I've been doing a new gig with a company called stockhouse.com, and I do a lot of market work for that company now, write-ups on companies. And, it's just a nice change of pace for me, because I'm able to, write about good stories with various companies, as opposed to just the steady, a stream of depressing articles that I have to write when I cover the economy. But that said, I'm also still writing for SprottMoney.com. And so I put out the same sort of pieces there. And as we mentioned, that's where my When the Tidal Wave Hits series is currently appearing. And so our readers can still see the same sort of work they're used to seeing at that site there.
Jeff, once again, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dave, and I look forward to being back again.